The first sign something was wrong wasn't the notice taped to my door or the sudden email marked urgent. It was the empty space where my car should have been, and the sinking feeling that comes when reality refuses to match memory. I had parked in my assigned spot the night before, the same spot I'd paid for when I bought the condo, the same spot listed in my deed, the same spot I'd used for 3 years without issue. And yet, that morning, it was gone. At first, I assumed the obvious. A mistake. A misunderstanding. Maybe a visitor had parked there overnight, and the tow truck took the wrong vehicle. HOA communities thrive on paperwork, and paperwork makes mistakes. That's what I told myself as I stood in the parking lot, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the fresh tire marks leading away from my spot. But then I noticed something else. A bright orange towing authorization sticker, half peeled from the asphalt. Still bearing the HOA logo and a signature I recognized instantly, the treasurer in our community. The HOA treasurer wasn't just a volunteer managing numbers. She was power with the spreadsheet. She controlled fines, approvals, reimbursements, and anything involving money. Over time, she'd become the unofficial enforcer of rules no one remembered voting on. Parking was her favorite battlefield. Temporary passes, overnight rules, guest limits, she enforced them all with a level of enthusiasm that felt personal. Still, even she couldn't just tow a car from a deeded spot. At least, that's what I believed, by the time I'd tracked my car to the impound lot and paid the fee to get it released. Shock had turned into anger. Not explosive anger, but the slow, focused kind that sharpens memory and attention. I pulled out my closing documents that night and reread the section outlining my parking space. Unit number. Spot number. Exclusive use. No ambiguity. No shared rights. No expiration. I sent an email to the HOA management company attaching proof and requesting reimbursement. The response came back colder than expected. According to their records, the parking spot had been reassigned months earlier. They claimed I was using a space no longer allocated to my unit. That was impossible. I requested documentation. The reply included a scanned agreement I'd never seen, never signed, and never authorized. It transferred my parking spot to another unit in exchange for a one-time payment I had never received. At the bottom of the page was the treasurer's signature and a date. From 6 months prior, that's when the story shifted from inconvenience to something darker. I wasn't just being fined or towed. On paper, I no longer owned my parking spot. The next few days were consumed by research. County records still listed the spot as mine. My mortgage company confirmed it. My title insurance flagged the HOA document as invalid, and yet the HOA continued to enforce the reassignment as if it were law. Every time I parked there, a warning appeared. Every time I called, I was told the matter was settled. Then I noticed a pattern. Neighbors began whispering about parking issues. Another car towed overnight. A new owner claiming rights to a spot someone else had used for years. Complaints dismissed with identical language. The same signature. The same treasurer. It became clear that my situation wasn't isolated. It was systematic. The treasurer had discovered a loophole, thought she had. Parking spots were valuable in our community, especially deeded ones. Units with guaranteed parking sold faster and for more money. Buyers wanted them. Renters paid premiums for them. And she controlled the records by quietly reassigning spots through unofficial agreements. She could collect under-the-table payments, approve transfers without board votes, and pocket the difference. On paper, everything looked clean enough to discourage casual challenges. In practice, it was a house of cards built on forged consent. I decided to test the system. One evening, I parked deliberately in my spot and left my car there overnight. By morning, another notice appeared, this one threatening towing within hours. But something else had changed. A new vehicle was parked halfway into the space, angled aggressively, as if daring me to object. A luxury SUV with a fresh temporary tag. The spot had been sold again. I learned through a neighbor that a new homeowner had moved into the building just days earlier. According to HOA records, they had purchased exclusive rights to that exact parking space as part of their closing package. They believed it was theirs, legally and permanently, just like I did to owners. One spot, the treasurer had sold the same parking space twice. The tension escalated quickly. Notices multiplied. Emails went unanswered. The management company deferred responsibility, claiming they acted on board instructions. The board claimed the treasurer handled parking independently, and the treasurer herself remained unreachable, citing limited availability. Then came the warning from the towing company. They had received authorization to remove any unauthorized vehicle from the spot, starting immediately. Both vehicles qualified as unauthorized, depending on which document you believed. I realized what was coming before it happened. Two homeowners, both convinced they were right, both armed with paperwork, both one tow truck away from losing thousands of dollars in their patience. The HOA had created a conflict designed to resolve itself through chaos. The morning it finally happened, I arrived early. Not to move my car, but to watch. The other owner was already there, standing near the SUV, holding a folder thick with documents. The tow truck idled nearby, waiting for a clear directive. The air was tense, heavy with confusion and certainty on both sides. Neither of us spoke, but the situation said everything. This wasn't about parking anymore. It was about power, fraud. It's a quiet assumption that homeowners wouldn't push back hard enough to expose it. As the tow operator approached, phone in hand, waiting for final confirmation from the HOA. I knew this moment would decide how far the treasurer's scheme could go. Either one of us would lose our car, or the truth would finally surface. And as the tow truck's engine revved slightly, signaling a decision was about to be made. I understood that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than a parking dispute. The tow truck never moved that morning, not because the HOA intervened, but because uncertainty froze everyone in place. The operator stood between two vehicles, two sets of documents, and one authorization that suddenly didn't feel solid enough to act on. He did what people do when liability becomes real. He stepped back and made a call. That pause, that single delay, changed everything. While the operator waited, I did something the HOA never expected. I documented everything. Photos of both cars. Time-stamped images of the parking space number painted on the asphalt. Copies of every notice, every email, every forged agreement. I emailed the HOA board, the management company, and the treasurer directly outlining the conflict in plain terms. Two owners. One spot. Two payments. One signature. I asked a single question. Who was going to take responsibility when this turned into a legal disaster? The response came faster than anything I'd received before. Not an answer, but a warning. I was told to stop interfering with HOA enforcement actions and to cease contacting board members directly. The language was defensive, almost panicked. It didn't deny the double sale. It just tried to silence it. That told me everything. The other homeowner, still standing near their vehicle, began making calls of their own. Their tone shifted from confused to alarmed as they realized they weren't dealing with a simple mistake. Their realtor confirmed the parking spot had been advertised as exclusive. Their closing documents referenced HOA confirmation. Their lender had factored it into the loan. The spot had been a selling point. By midday, the tow truck left without towing anything. But the damage was already done. Two homeowners had now compared paperwork and discovered that the same HOA officer had promised the same asset to two different people. Months apart, collecting money both times. What had been hidden behind quiet emails and isolated fines was now visible in daylight. That visibility spread quickly. Word traveled through the community faster than any official notice. People started checking their own documents. Longtime residents realized their parking spots had been temporarily reassigned during renovations and never returned. New owners questioned why their assigned spots were suddenly contested. Renters wondered why guest passes had become impossible to obtain without side payments. Patterns emerged. Every questionable decision led back to the same person. The treasurer, her control over the HOA's finances had allowed her to operate without oversight. She approved her own reimbursements. She handled parking agreements off record. She insisted on urgency whenever someone questioned a fee, pushing homeowners to pay first and ask questions later. And for years, it worked. Until now, the board scheduled an emergency meeting, closed to homeowners. That alone raised suspicion. In response, residents organized. Someone printed flyers. Someone else created a group chat. Stories poured in. Missing refunds. Surprise fines. Unauthorized charges. Parking spots reassigned without consent. The parking issue wasn't the exception, it was the most visible. Symptom of a much larger problem. When the board finally released a statement, it was vague and carefully worded. They acknowledged clerical inconsistencies and promised an internal review. No mention of refunds. No suspension of enforcement. No accountability. It was the kind of response designed to buy time. Time was something they no longer had. The other homeowner and I took the next step together. We filed formal complaints with the county, the state HOA oversight office, and our title insurance companies. We included evidence of double sale, forged signatures, and unauthorized transfers of deeded property rights. Once those complaints were filed, the issue moved beyond the HOA's control. That's when the treasurer finally resurfaced. She sent a long email explaining that the situation was a misunderstanding caused by outdated records. She suggested that one of us had misunderstood our rights and offered to resolve the issue by reassigning a different parking spot of equal value. It was an attempt to divide us. To isolate the problem again, it didn't work. We compared her explanation to the documents. The dates didn't line up. The payments didn't match. The supposed approvals were missing required board votes, and the signature on my forged agreement was identical to hers. Down to a distinctive flourish she used on every document, the management company began distancing itself. They claimed they acted on instructions provided by the treasurer and had no authority to verify ownership changes. The board members stopped responding altogether. Silence replaced confidence. Then the towing company called me directly. They informed me that the HOA had attempted to authorize towing again, but the company refused. After reviewing the conflicting claims and potential legal exposure, they would no longer act on any parking enforcement requests from our HOA without court documentation. The enforcement mechanism the treasurer relied on had collapsed. That collapse triggered something else. Without towing as leverage, homeowners stopped complying. Cars returned to disputed spots. Fines went unpaid. Questions flooded the management office. The HOA's authority, once unquestioned, suddenly felt fragile. Pressure mounted from all sides. The treasurer's control over the narrative began to slip as board members realized the risk she posed to them personally. Emails surfaced, showing they'd deferred decisions to her without proper review. Financial reports revealed discrepancies. Funds collected for parking transfers were not clearly accounted for. Then came the audit request. A single homeowner, unrelated to the parking dispute, formally demanded a financial audit under state law. Once triggered, the HOA was legally required to comply. That audit would expose everything: the payments, the unauthorized agreements, the missing approvals. The treasurer resigned the next day. Her resignation email cited personal reasons and expressed disappointment in the lack of trust shown by the community. She did not deny wrongdoing. She did not apologize. She simply stepped away, likely hoping the issue would fade without her at the center. It didn't. Her resignation only intensified scrutiny. Without her shield, the board had to answer questions they'd avoided for years. And the audit moved forward without obstruction. As investigators began reviewing records, the truth became undeniable. The same parking spot had been sold multiple times. Money had been collected and never properly recorded. Documents had been altered. Signatures forged. Authority abused. For the first time since this began, the power balance shifted. The HOA was no longer the enforcer. It was the subject. And as the audit progressed, it became clear that the parking spot dispute was about to trigger consequences far beyond reimbursement or reassignment. This wasn't just about two homeowners anymore. It was about fraud, liability, and accountability. By the time the audit reached the parking records, the question was no longer who owned the spot. It was how many laws had been broken to take it. The audit didn't move quickly, but it moved relentlessly. Each week brought another request for records, another quiet meeting behind closed doors, another shift in the way the HOA communicated with residents. Notices that once carried threats and deadlines were suddenly filled with careful language and legal disclaimers. Enforcement paused. Fines were temporarily suspended. Parking violations were under review. The confidence the HOA once projected was gone, replaced by something brittle and defensive. Behind the scenes, the numbers told a story no one could spin. Payments labeled as parking transfers had no matching approvals. Funds were deposited in odd increments that didn't correspond to any official fee schedule. Some transactions were routed through reimbursement accounts instead of income categories. Others were recorded months late, as if someone had tried to backfill the books once questions started being asked. And at the center of nearly every irregularity was the former treasurer's name. The investigators flagged the double sale of my parking spot as a critical issue, not because it was the largest financial discrepancy, but because it was the clearest. 2 payments, 1 asset, 0 authority to sell it even once. That single fact made everything else easier to understand. This wasn't incompetence. It was intent. Once the findings reached the HOA's insurance carrier, the tone changed again. The board was informed that coverage might be denied if fraud by an officer was proven, and if the board failed to provide oversight. That meant personal liability. Suddenly, board members who had ignored emails and avoided meetings were eager to cooperate. Refunds began appearing quietly. Homeowners received checks without explanation, labeled as corrective adjustments. Parking assignments reverted to their original state. Fines were erased from accounts overnight. The HOA never admitted fault publicly, but its actions spoke clearly enough. They were trying to contain the damage. For me and the other homeowner caught in the middle, the resolution came in writing. A formal letter confirmed that the parking spot had always been mine, that the transfer document was invalid, and that the HOA acknowledged an error in its records. The other homeowner was reassigned a different spot and compensated for the difference in value. Both of us were reimbursed for towing threats, legal consultations, and associated costs. It should have felt like relief instead. It felt like vindication mixed with exhaustion. The real consequence arrived weeks later, quietly but decisively. The former treasurer was named in a civil action filed by the HOA itself. The board, desperate to protect what little credibility it had left, positioned her as a rogue actor who had deceived them all. They sought restitution for misappropriated funds and damages related to legal exposure. Then came the criminal referral: forgery, fraud, misuse of association funds, abuse of authority. The same signature that once intimidated homeowners now served as evidence. The same documents used to enforce fines were scrutinized line by line. What had once felt untouchable was suddenly very small under the weight of law. Residents noticed the change immediately. The fear that had kept people compliant dissolved. Questions were asked openly. Meetings filled again, not with silence, but with scrutiny. Policies were rewritten. Financial controls were implemented. The treasurer role was split, audited, and limited. Parking assignments were reviewed by an independent firm. The HOA survived. But it wasn't the same, and neither was the community. What struck me most was how close this all came to never being uncovered. If I hadn't challenged the tow, if the other homeowner hadn't compared documents, if the towing company hadn't paused, the system would have kept working exactly as designed, quietly extracting money from people who assumed resistance was pointless. That was the real lesson. The treasurer didn't rely on clever schemes. She relied on apathy, on the belief that fighting an HOA wasn't worth the stress, on the assumption that paperwork was final and authority unquestionable. She sold the same parking spot twice because she believed no one would ever lie. The documents up side by side. She was wrong. Months later, as I parked my car in the same spot that started it all, the space looked unchanged. Same faded lines. Same number on the asphalt. Same concrete beneath my tires, but the meaning of it had shifted completely. It wasn't just a parking space anymore. It was proof that power only works when no one challenges it. The HOA never issued a public apology. They never admitted wrongdoing beyond vague statements about process improvements. But the outcome didn't need one. The treasurer was gone. The money was returned. The system was forced into the light. And every time a new homeowner moved in and asked about parking, the story resurfaced not as gossip, but as a warning. Because in communities like ours, the real battles aren't about rules or spaces or fines. They're about who thinks they can get away with abuse. And who's willing to stand? Still long enough to expose it, the parking spot. Remained mine. But the power it revealed belonged to everyone who learned that day. That even the smallest piece of property is worth defending when someone tries to steal it twice.